This was April 7th, 1940. The sea was boiling, the sky was filled with screaming engines and falling fire, and in the middle of it all, the Yamato, pride of the Imperial Navy, was dying. Her black smoke clawed into the heavens. Her crew scrambled across steel decks slick with blood and oil, and the largest battleship ever built was about to meet her end. For centuries the ocean had swallowed ships, storms had broken fleets, but never before had the sea prepared to take such a giant. And as the bombs fell and the water heaved, the men who sailed upon her knew that history itself was watching. Off the southern shores of Japan, the last days of an empire were unraveling, and Yamato, once a symbol of untouchable power, had become a pawn in a desperate final gamble. The ship that had been meant to dominate oceans was now on a one-way voyage to death. The men aboard knew it, the commanders who sent her knew it. Even the enemy watching from above understood the futility. Yet still she sailed, because honor, pride, and duty demanded it. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it, where you are? The Pacific in 1945 was no longer the Empire's ocean. The United States had fought across island after island, through coral reefs and jungles, through minefields and fortifications, and now the war had reached the very doorstep of Japan. Okinawa was burning. American soldiers and Marines bled daily on its ridges and beaches. Kamikaze pilots hurled themselves at destroyers and carriers. The ocean was alive with steel and fire, and into that maelstrom Japan's last great ship prepared for her final stand. Yamato had been built in secret years earlier, her existence shielded by silence. When she was launched in 1941, she was the largest warship ever conceived, more than 70,000 tons of steel bristling with 9 massive 18.1-inch guns. In theory, no enemy ship could match her. In practice, the rise of air power had already changed the rules. The sky had become the ocean's master. Battleships, once kings of war, were now vulnerable giants. Yet the myth of Yamato persisted. Among her crew, she was not just a ship. She was a world, a steel city that carried their fates. Many believed she was the floating embodiment of the empire itself, the last fortress standing between Japan and defeat. To sail upon her was to be part of history, even if that history ended in flames. On the morning of her final mission, thousands of sailors rose from their hammocks and prepared for departure. Some were teenagers barely old enough to shave, others veterans who had survived years of naval war. Many carried letters folded in their uniforms, knowing they would never post them. They cleaned their weapons, tightened their boots, and stared silently at the horizon. Rumors had already spread. Few believed they would return. The order was called Operation 10 Go. It was not strategy, it was sacrifice. Yamato, accompanied by one cruiser and a handful of destroyers, was to steam south toward Okinawa. She had barely enough fuel for a one-way voyage. Her task was simple and impossible. Beach herself upon the island, fight until destroyed, and die as a fortress of fire. It was in essence a suicide mission for the largest ship ever built. American intelligence already knew. Radio intercepts and reconnaissance had given away the movement. High above the Pacific, the U.S. Navy and U.S. Army Air Forces prepared their planes. Carriers filled the horizon. Flight decks crowded with bombers and torpedo planes, engines warming. Pilots strapped into cockpits, knowing they were about to fight not just a ship but a legend. Some felt awe, others indifference, yet all understood the mission. Yamato could not be allowed to reach Okinawa. And so, on that morning, the paths of history converged. On one side, the pride of a dying empire sailing into certain destruction. On the other, the vast armada of a rising superpower determined to end the war sooner, no matter the cost. Between them lay the ocean, endless, indifferent, waiting to decide which would vanish beneath its waves. The silence before contact was heavy. On Yamato's bridge, officers stared out at the horizon, their eyes unblinking, their hearts hidden behind uniforms of blue. Below decks, engineers stoked the engines, sweat pouring as steel trembled beneath their hands. And somewhere in the distance, invisible against the sun, the first American planes were already forming up, wings glinting like blades of light. The stage was set, the ocean was waiting, and the Yamato was sailing into fate. The empire was breathing its last, and every man in Tokyo knew it. By April of 1945, the war that had begun with fire at Pearl Harbor was collapsing under the weight of reality. Japan's cities were being pounded nightly by B-29 superfortress bombers, their skies filled with firestorms that erased entire neighborhoods in hours. Industry was crippled, oil was gone, and the ocean routes that once brought resources from Asia were strangled by American submarines and surface patrols. The empire that had once stretched from the jungles of Burma to the sands of Wake Island was now reduced to its own homeland, surrounded by flames. The Imperial Navy, once a force that struck fear across the Pacific, was a shadow of itself. Carriers that had launched waves of planes against Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea were gone, sunk in battles where American steel and production had proven relentless. Destroyers, cruisers, and smaller ships had been fed into the furnace of war until only fragments remained. What lingered in the harbors of Japan were hulks and ghosts, ships too proud to admit their irrelevance, crews too loyal to abandon their posts. And at the center of that fading fleet stood Yamato, massive, beautiful, and doomed. It was Admiral Soma Toyoda, chief of the combined fleet, who approved the mission. He knew the truth. He knew Yamato had barely enough fuel to sail to Okinawa, that the plan was less strategy than theater, a gesture of defiance written in steel. Yet there was no other choice left. The Americans were preparing to invade Okinawa, the last barrier before the home islands themselves. To let them land unopposed would be dishonor. To resist, even in futility, was duty. Toyoda signed the order, knowing he was sending thousands of sailors to death. Operation 10 Go, as it was called, was named for the heavenly numeral 10, a symbol of divine struggle. But in reality, it was desperation. The mission called for Yamato to lead a handful of escorts south, fight its way through American air dominance, and ground itself on Okinawa's shores. Once beached, her guns would fire until silenced, her crew would fight until gone, and her destruction would serve as both fortress and monument. It was a plan that ignored the reality of American control of the air, but it satisfied the Empire's obsession with sacrifice. On the ship herself, sailors whispered among themselves. Many already knew. Japan had long trained its warriors to embrace death as honor, but this was something different. This was an entire crew, thousands of men being asked to march together into a single grave. Some accepted it with stoic calm. Others wrote quiet letters home. One young sailor, barely 17, folded a piece of paper and tucked it into his cap, a farewell that would never be read. Another polished his rifle until the steel reflected his own eyes back at him, perhaps the last reflection he would ever see. They were men caught between pride and despair, duty and futility. Among the officers, there was no illusion. Vice Admiral Shichi, who commanded the mission, had argued against it. He called it meaningless, a waste of men and steel. But when the Emperor's will was invoked, when honor demanded obedience, he bowed his head and accepted. He knew he was going to his death, yet he would lead his men without hesitation. That was the code. That was the burden. A commander did not abandon his crew, even in madness. On April 6, 1945, Yamato's orders were delivered. Her engines were prepared, her guns inspected, her crew assembled at the naval base at Tokuyama. Fuel was loaded. Enough for a one-way trip south. The men watched as the black liquid filled the tanks. Understanding what it meant, to fill half a belly, was to accept that return was not expected. In that moment, silence spread across the decks. Even the gulls circling overhead seemed to fall quiet. The Americans were not blind. Radio operators at Pearl Harbor and Guam had long been intercepting Japan's signals. Reconnaissance planes flew over the inland sea, cameras clicking, noting movements. Analysts in darkened rooms compared maps and estimates. Yamato's sortie was no secret. The U.S. Navy had prepared for her. Aircraft carriers stood ready, their flight decks crowded with Avengers and Helldivers, Corsairs and Hellcats. Pilots gathered in briefings where the words were simple: destroy Yamato before she could reach Okinawa. The greatest battleship in the world was about to be hunted not by another ship, but by the sky. Still, within Japan there was ceremony. Yamato's sailors gathered for final addresses, words spoken not with optimism, but with gravity. They were told their sacrifice would protect the homeland, that their deaths would inspire the nation, that to die aboard Yamato was to live forever in the memory of the empire. Some cheered, voices trembling with devotion. Others simply lowered their eyes. The human heart cannot always be commanded, even by honor. When the sun set that evening, lanterns flickered aboard the battleship, casting long shadows across the steel. Men sat in groups, smoking cigarettes, playing cards, or staring into the darkness. Somewhere below decks, a harmonica played a soft tune, notes echoing against bulkheads. It might have been a love song, or a prayer, or simply a way to keep silence at bay. In every corner of the ship, the knowledge was the same: tomorrow they would leave, and most would never see land again. And so the empire breathed, shallow and ragged, clinging to pride while the world around it collapsed. Yamato was no longer a weapon of victory, she was a stage for the last act of a tragedy. She would carry the weight of thousands, the hopes of a nation, and the inevitability of defeat. The ocean waited, vast and indifferent, ready to accept her offering. The Americans waited too, patient, prepared, and merciless. History itself leaned forward, for the curtain was about to rise on the last voyage of the sea's greatest monster. She was not just a ship. She was a kingdom forged of steel, a floating fortress that carried within her the ambitions of an empire. Yamato was born in secrecy, constructed within massive covered docks at Kure so that no foreign eye could glimpse her shape. When she slid into the water in December of 1941, only days after Pearl Harbor, she embodied the belief that Japan could build something greater than the world had ever seen. She was the ultimate battleship, a weapon meant to ensure supremacy over oceans, a guardian of the empire's destiny. Yamato stretched 863 feet from bow to stern. Her displacement exceeded 70,000 tons, her armor thick enough to shrug off shells from any enemy battleship afloat. At her heart stood 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighed more than 3,000 pounds, taller than a man, capable of smashing through armor at distances beyond the horizon. To the men who served her, those guns were gods of thunder, each firing a roar that shook the sea itself. Her decks bristled with secondary batteries, smaller guns meant to tear into cruisers and destroyers, and later, as the threat from above grew undeniable, anti-aircraft guns sprouted across her superstructure like thorns, hundreds of barrels ready to spit fire into the sky. Yet even this arsenal could not keep pace with the new reality, where swarms of aircraft could descend like locusts upon even the strongest warship. But Yamato's power was not just in her steel or her guns, it was in her symbolism. For the Japanese people, she was the floating embodiment of their nation's spirit. Her very name echoed with ancient poetry, Yamato, the cradle of Japanese civilization, the word used to describe the soul of the nation itself. To sail aboard her was to carry the weight of centuries, to be part of something eternal. The men who crewed her numbered nearly 3,000. They filled every deck, every compartment, from the bridge where officers stared out with solemn eyes, to the boiler rooms below where sweat and fire mingled in suffocating heat. She was a city of men, a place where lives intersected in corridors of steel, where friendships formed in bunks barely wide enough to roll over, where laughter could echo one night and silence reign the next. Some sailors loved her, believing she was invincible, the greatest ship to ever sail. Others saw her as a burden, a massive beast too slow, too obvious, too vulnerable in a sky ruled by aircraft. But whether they adored her or doubted her, she shaped their lives. Every dawn, bugles sounded, and men stood to stations, cleaning guns, tightening lines, polishing brass. The ship demanded constant labor, constant devotion. She was alive only because they gave themselves to her. For years Yamato had sailed in shadow. She had fought at the Battle of the Philippine Sea and at Leyte Gulf, where she unleashed her massive guns against American carriers and escorts. But each time she returned, less of the fleet came back with her. One by one, Japan's carriers were sent to the bottom, its destroyers shattered, its cruisers broken. Yamato remained, towering over harbors, the last queen of the fleet, and yet her size became a curse. Fuel grew scarce, and to move her was to drain reserves needed elsewhere. By 1945, she was anchored more often than she sailed, a giant waiting for a purpose that no longer existed. Now that purpose had been found, not victory, not even survival, but spectacle. Her final mission was not to win, but to die in such a way that her death would inspire, to the men who ordered her south. She was a sword to be broken in ceremony, a torch to light the last days of resistance. To the men aboard, she was home, prison, and coffin all at once. Inside her hull, life went on with eerie normalcy as departure neared. Cooks prepared rice and miso in giant vats, the scent drifting through the mess decks. Gunners checked their ammunition hoists, feeding practice shells up and down. Engineers adjusted turbines, listening to the rhythm of pistons. On the bridge, maps were unfolded, compasses aligned, orders whispered. From a distance, Yamato looked serene, her white wake spreading like silk behind her bow. Up close, every inch of her vibrated with the knowledge of what was coming. Sailors who had grown up in villages stared at her massive bulkheads and could hardly believe they were real. The ship was larger than their entire town, with corridors stretching longer than any street they had walked. They touched the steel, felt its coldness, and wondered if it could truly protect them when the sky turned black with planes. Others avoided such thoughts, clinging instead to routines, polishing boots, writing letters, laughing too loudly at crude jokes, as if normality itself could keep fate at bay. Among the crew, belief mingled with doubt. Some whispered that Yamato was unsinkable, that no American bomb could pierce her armor, that she would stand forever as a wall against invasion. Others, more experienced, remembered what had happened to Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, sunk in the Battle of Leyte Gulf by waves of American aircraft. They knew armor meant nothing when the sky was filled with fire. They knew they were walking into the same storm. And yet, there was pride. To serve aboard Yamato was to be part of something larger than life. Men told themselves that if they must die, then let it be here, on the greatest warship the world had ever known. Better to vanish beneath the sea as part of a legend than to wither in defeat ashore. This was the thinking of a nation raised on the code of Bushido, the belief that death in duty was not an end but an honor. As the sun rose over the inland sea, Yamato's massive silhouette stretched across the water. Her guns pointed toward the horizon, black barrels gleaming. Smoke curled from her funnels as her engines stirred to life. The sound rolled across the waves, deep and resonant, like the heartbeat of a titan. She was awake, she was moving, and the sea itself seemed to tremble as the monster prepared to leave her lair. No other battleship in history would ever equal her in size, in myth, in meaning, and none would ever carry so many men into a fate so certain. Yamato was more than steel. She was pride, tragedy, and inevitability given form. The Americans watching from afar would see only a target. The Japanese who served aboard saw a goddess, terrible and beautiful, who demanded everything from them in return for the honor of standing upon her decks. And so Yamato sailed, her bow cutting through the water, her crew gathered at stations, her legend intact. She was the sea's monster, and she was heading for her last battle. The morning of April 6th broke with a pale light over the inland sea. The water was still, a mirror of grey clouds above, and the air was cool with the scent of spring blossoms drifting from the hills. It was a morning that seemed too quiet for war, too calm for the burden that waited. Yet deep in the naval base at Tokiyama, Yamato stirred, her boilers hissed, her turbines hummed, and her black funnels began to trail smoke that curled skyward like the first breath of a waking giant. On her decks, sailors moved with practiced rhythm. Lines were coiled, hatches checked, guns polished until they gleamed. Some men carried their rifles with a strange reverence, as if already saying goodbye. Others stood silently, staring out across the water toward a horizon they would never return from. It was not a routine departure. Every man aboard knew it. Yamato was sailing to her grave. At 9 in the morning, the order was given. Lines were cast off. Tugboats eased the great battleship away from her berth. Her bow swung slowly toward the open water, and the ship that had been a secret for so many years now moved with all the majesty of a floating mountain. She was flanked by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, her escorts for the journey south. Together they formed a small task force, but against the power that awaited them they were no more than offerings to the sea. On shore, families gathered to watch. Mothers held children, wives clutched husbands' letters, old men stood with caps in hand. They said nothing, but their eyes followed the ship as she glided away. Some waved, though they knew their loved ones could not see from the distance. Others simply stood still, hearts heavy, watching as the monster of steel carried their sons into the horizon. Aboard the ship, Admiral Seiichi Etu remained calm on the bridge. He had argued bitterly against this mission, had called it folly, but when the order was confirmed and the Emperor's will was invoked, he had bowed to duty. Now he stood in silence, his face a mask, his heart unreadable. Around him officers worked with precision, charts spread across tables, compasses steady. Their professionalism could not erase the truth that hung in the air like smoke. They were commanding men towards certain death. Below decks, the atmosphere was more intimate. In mess halls, sailors shared bowls of rice, laughing too loudly, voices sharp with forced cheer. Some smoked their last cigarettes slowly, savoring each drag, as though it might stretch time. Others scribbled letters on scraps of paper, knowing they would never be delivered. One man carved a small charm from wood, running his fingers over the grain as if it could shield him. Another tucked a family photograph inside his tunic, pressing it close to his chest. Engineers worked stripped to the waist, sweat already beading on their foreheads as the turbines roared to life. The sound was deafening, the heat suffocating. Yet they carried on, hands steady, eyes fixed on gauges and valves. They were the heart of Yamato, and they would keep her alive until the ocean swallowed them. Above, gunners stood ready at their stations. The great 18-inch guns loomed over them like towers, silent for now, their black barrels angled toward the sky. Smaller anti-aircraft weapons were manned by boys barely out of school, their hands trembling as they gripped triggers. They had been told to fight until the end, to fire until the barrels melted, to die with honor. Some nodded bravely. Others simply swallowed hard and stared at the empty sky. As the fleet moved south, through the narrow waters of the inland sea, villagers along the coast watched in silence. Fishermen paused in their boats, staring as Yamato passed like a mountain drifting across the waves. To them she was both pride and tragedy, the greatest ship their nation had built, and yet a symbol of how far their empire had fallen. They bowed their heads as she passed, some in reverence, others in mourning. By afternoon, the sea grew rougher, the waves lifting and dropping the massive hull. Yamato took it easily, her bulk steady against the swell, but inside her decks the men felt the roll and sway. In the officers' mess, sake was poured. It was tradition, a farewell drink before battle. Cups were raised, words spoken softly for the emperor, for Japan, for honor. Some men drank deeply, letting the warmth blur their fear. Others sipped in silence, eyes distant. They knew these were their last toasts. That evening, as the sun sank low, the fleet anchored briefly to await the following dawn's movement. The sky turned crimson, the sea burning with reflected light, as if nature itself mirrored the fate awaiting them. On deck, sailors gathered in small groups. Some sang songs, their voices carried by the wind. Others prayed quietly, hands folded, lips moving without sound. The harmonica played again, its lonely notes drifting across the steel, carried into the night. A few men spoke openly of their fears. One young sailor confessed to his bunkmate that he did not want to die, that he wanted to see his family again. His bunkmate said nothing, only placed a hand on his shoulder. There were no words that could change the truth. Death waited, it was only a question of when. And still, Yamato pressed forward. The following morning, April 7th, she would clear the inland sea and move into open ocean. There, American reconnaissance would find her. There, the sky would open with engines and fire. The men aboard knew it, even if no one dared say it aloud. On her bridge, Admiral Ito looked out into the gathering night. His officers awaited orders, his sailors awaited fate, but he stood in stillness, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Perhaps he thought of Musashi, Yamato's sister, sunk by planes months earlier. Perhaps he thought of his family, of the life that might have been. Or perhaps he thought of nothing at all, letting silence fill the spaces words could not reach. As night fell, Yamato's running lights blinked faintly in the darkness. Her massive silhouette loomed against the stars, her escorts trailing like shadows. She was a titan in motion, a goddess sailing toward death. And within her steel body thousands of men lay awake in hammocks, listening to the hum of engines, the creak of bulkheads, the endless heartbeat of the sea. The departure was complete. The fate was sealed. Yamato had left the safety of her harbor, and there would be no return. Far away from the inland sea, across the wide Pacific, another fleet was watching. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance lay off Okinawa, an armada so vast that its ships seemed to stretch to the horizon. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers filled the waters, their decks bristling with aircraft, their radios alive with signals. Above them, the sky hummed with patrols, fighters wheeling in slow arcs, bombers forming up in practice runs. It was April 7, 1945, and the Americans had been waiting for this moment. For weeks, intelligence reports had whispered of Yamato's possible sortie, radio intercept units, working with cryptographic teams who had cracked Japan's codes, pieced together fragments of orders, fuel requests, and strange movements. Reconnaissance aircraft, long-range PB-4Y Liberators and carrier-based scouts, had flown over the inland sea and noted unusual activity. To the analysts, it was clear. Japan was preparing to gamble its last great ship in a desperate strike at Okinawa. At dawn, American patrol planes swept wide over the ocean, their crews squinting through windshields as they searched for wakes on the surface below. Somewhere out there, Yamato was coming. Every man aboard knew what it meant. To sink the largest battleship ever built would not just be a victory, it would be a statement, the final proof that air power had ended the age of giants. On the carriers, pilots gathered in briefing rooms, the smell of coffee and sweat filling the air. Maps were unrolled, showing arcs of possible contact. The officers pointed with sticks, tracing Yamato's likely course south toward Okinawa. The mission was simple in words, brutal in reality. Find her, overwhelm her, sink her before she could ever reach the shore. Pilots scribbled notes, checked watches, and whispered to one another. Some were veterans who had fought through the Marianas, the Philippines, Leyte Gulf. Others were barely out of training, young men thrust into history's deadliest war. They were told Yamato carried armor so thick that only torpedoes could truly finish her. Bombs could hurt her, rip apart her decks, but to break her spine and roll her over, torpedo hits were essential. The plan was set. Waves of Helldivers would strike from above, Avengers from below, Corsairs and Hellcats would sweep the skies clear of any Japanese planes. Against Yamato it would not be a duel, it would be a storm. On flight decks, engines coughed to life. Grumman TBF Avengers sat in rows, their wings folded like sleeping birds. Douglas SB-2C. Helldivers gleamed in the morning sun, their bomb racks loaded. Fighters warmed their engines, propellers spinning into blur. The air was alive with the tang of fuel and the thunder of machinery. Deck crews in colored shirts sprinted across planks, signaling with flags, guiding planes into position. The pilots checked their gear, goggles adjusted, oxygen masks fitted, pistols strapped to hips. Some carried lucky charms, a coin from home, a ribbon from a sweetheart, a Bible tucked into a pocket. They joked with one another, the laughter too sharp, covering nerves they would not admit. In the air, death came suddenly, and every man knew it. But this mission, they told themselves, was different. They were hunting a legend, a ship whose very name had shadowed their war. At 10 in the morning, the first American scout plane spotted Yamato. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio. Urgent, barely contained. Enemy task force sighted. Battleship, 1 cruiser, several destroyers. Course south. His words shot across the airwaves, reaching the flagships, reaching Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of the carrier force. Within minutes, the order went out. Launch the strike, all available planes. Yamato had been found. On the carriers, the tempo exploded. Klaxons wailed. Men shouted. Mechanics fueled and armed in frantic speed. Pilots ran to their planes, clambering into cockpits, strapping themselves in. Deck officers waved signals. The first fighters rolled into position. Engines roared, winds screamed across the decks. Then the first Hellcat shot forward, its wheels leaving wood as it lifted into the sky. One by one they launched fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, until the air above the fleet swirled with hundreds of aircraft, a storm rising into formation. From Yamato's bridge far across the waves, a lookout spotted faint specks in the sky, tiny dots at first growing larger, like a swarm of insects against the sun. The alarm clanged. Anti-aircraft crews ran to stations. Ammunition was loaded, guns swung skyward. Every man knew what it meant. The Americans had found them. For the pilots in the air, the sight of Yamato was breathtaking. Below them, the largest battleship ever built carved through the ocean, her wake stretching for miles, her grey bulk gleaming. She looked like a fortress adrift, a monster of steel that defied imagination. And yet, to their eyes, she was also a target. They tightened grips on control sticks, checked their sights, adjusted formation. In a few minutes, the sky and sea would explode. Some pilots felt awe, almost reluctant to attack something so magnificent. Others felt nothing but focus. Their minds narrowed to the task of survival and strike. They knew she carried thousands of men, but war had long stripped away illusions. Yamato was not men, she was an enemy, and she had to die. The first wave descended. Engines screamed, bombs armed, torpedoes ready. The sky darkened with wings, the sea shimmered with sunlight. Below, Yamato's decks erupted with fire as anti-aircraft guns opened, tracers stitching the air, black puffs of flak bursting among the planes. The battle had begun. The horizon dissolved into movement. What had been specks in the distance became wings of steel, their engines screaming like thunder across the sky. Yamato's lookouts shouted the warning, their voices sharp, echoing through the steel corridors of the ship. Bells clanged, whistles shrieked, and every man aboard the battleship snapped to his station. In an instant, the ship was alive with urgency, thousands of sailors running, guns elevating, ammunition hoists grinding. The time had come. From the bridge, Admiral Seiichi Ito raised his binoculars. Against the bright morning light he could see them now, wave after wave of American aircraft sweeping toward his ship. They glittered like a swarm of locusts, sunlight flashing off wings, the roar of engines growing louder by the second. He had known this moment was inevitable, yet even he felt the weight in his chest as Yamato braced to meet her fate. Below decks, sailors felt the vibrations of the ship's engines quicken as the order was given to increase speed. Yamato surged forward, churning white water in her wake. Her escort destroyers tightened formation, their guns swinging upward as well. Men shouted orders over the noise of machinery, hands blistering as shells were lifted, belts of ammunition rattled into place. The decks trembled with anticipation, with fear, with duty. At 11:30 a.m., the first American planes struck. Helldivers swooped down almost vertically, their sirens shrieking, bombs clamped beneath their bellies. From Yamato's decks, gunners opened fire. Dozens of anti-aircraft guns thundered, tracers streaking upward in red and orange, the sky filling with bursts of black flak. The air shook with the fury of steel against steel. A helldiver shuddered as it plunged, hit by tracers, smoke trailing, but it released its bomb before vanishing into the sea. The explosion blossomed on Yamato's deck, a plume of smoke and fire rising, men thrown to the ground by the blast. Torpedo planes came next. Avengers skimmed low across the waves, their engines barely above the water, white spray rising from their wingtips. Their torpedoes glinted silver as they dropped, hitting the surface with violent splashes and then streaking beneath the sea toward Yamato's hull. Alarms wailed. The helm spun, the ship heeled hard to port, her bulk groaning under the sudden maneuver. Men clung to railings, the deck tilting as water foamed against the armor belt. 2 torpedoes streaked past harmlessly, but one slammed into her side with a thunderous crack. The ship lurched, a shudder passing through every deck. In the boiler rooms, men were thrown from platforms, pipes burst, steam hissed, scalding the skin of those too close. But the engineers fought to keep her alive, hands burned, lungs filled with smoke, hearts pounding. They knew one hit would not kill her. Yamato was too massive, her armor too thick, but more were coming. Always more. Above, the sky turned into chaos. American fighters streaked through, machine guns rattling as they cut down gunners on the open decks. Sailors fired back desperately, their weapons tracing arcs through the air, shells bursting around the diving planes. The noise was relentless. A storm of engines, gunfire, explosions, and screams. Smoke stung the eyes. Fire licked along the wooden decks. Shrapnel tore through flesh and steel alike. The battle was no longer theory, no longer whispers of inevitability. It was here, now, and it was merciless. Admiral Ito stood steady on the bridge, his officers reporting hits, fires, casualties. He gave his orders calmly, his voice even, though he knew every word was one step closer to the inevitable. Maintain course, return fire. To falter was to dishonor the men who trusted him. He would command until the sea claimed him. For the American pilots, the sight below was staggering. Yamato filled their vision. Her size unlike anything they had attacked before, even hit, even burning. She moved with power, her guns firing defiantly, her hull refusing to yield. Some pilots felt a flicker of awe as they released bombs and torpedoes, watching explosions ripple across her deck. Others felt only focus, adjusting flight paths, calling out to wingmen, pressing the attack again and again. One torpedo slammed into her port side. Then another. The ship groaned, listing slightly, but her pumps roared to life, her compartments sealing as damage control teams rushed to battle stations. Men dragged hoses across decks slick with blood and oil, spraying foam over flames. Others carried wounded comrades below, their cries mixing with the thunder of guns. Still others simply kept firing, eyes locked on the sky, knowing they might only have minutes left. From a distance, Yamato was a mountain surrounded by fire. Bombs exploded on her decks. Smoke columns rose, planes dived and climbed, torpedoes streaked through the water. Yet still she fought, her great guns booming, shells streaking upward, bursts of flak tearing the sky. She was wounded, but she was not yet defeated. To her crew she was still the embodiment of their nation's pride. To the Americans she was still the target that had to be destroyed at all costs. The first wave withdrew, planes banking hard, their bomb bays empty, their torpedoes gone. Behind them, another wave formed, lining up for attack. The battle was far from over. For Yamato, the first contact had been survived, but at a cost that could not be ignored. Fires burned on her decks, men lay broken, compartments flooded, but the ship still moved forward. And as the sound of the next wave grew louder, as new specks appeared in the sky, every man aboard knew the truth. The storm had only begun. The sea had turned black with smoke and the sky was alive with wings. After the first strike, Yamato still held her course, bleeding fire and oil but defiantly afloat, her guns roaring upward. Yet across the horizon the second wave was already closing in, more than 100 planes sweeping in from every direction. The storm was gathering and the monster at the center was about to face its most savage hour. From Yamato's decks, the sound was unending. The crash of anti-aircraft batteries, the stutter of lighter guns, the whine of shells ripping past, the hollow boom of near misses exploding in the sea. The ship herself seemed to shudder with every impact. Steel plates buckled, wooden decks splintered, and men were thrown from their feet again and again. Yet still the gunners worked, their faces blackened with smoke, hands blistered from the heat of their weapons. Shell casings clattered across the decks, rolling into corners, piling ankle-deep where no one stopped to clear them. The American planes came in waves, disciplined, relentless. Helldivers plunged almost vertically, their bomb bays yawning open. Torpedo Avengers skimmed low, the ocean spray streaming from their wings as they loosed their deadly cargo. Fighters strafed decks with machine gun fire, tearing through lines of sailors, cutting down men at their stations. Yamato's flak guns clawed the air, ripping holes in the sky, but for every plane that spiraled into the sea, 10 more pressed on. At 11:45, another torpedo slammed into Yamato's port side. The ship heeled sharply, water rushing into compartments, men scrambling to seal bulkheads, pumps strained, engineers shouted above the roar, but the list was worsening. Inside, darkness swallowed compartments where lights failed, sailors working by touch, choking on smoke, dragging hoses through rising water. Some never made it out, sealed behind watertight doors as damage control tried desperately to save the ship. Above deck, fires raged. Bombs had torn holes through the armored roof, flames leaping upward, ammunition cooking off in sudden bursts that ripped through the superstructure. Gunners died at their posts, their bodies flung across steel, their weapons still aimed at the sky. Others stepped forward to replace them without hesitation, gripping hot triggers, eyes locked on the diving aircraft, pride and desperation fused into one. From the bridge, Admiral Ito remained at his post, his voice calm though his ship shook like a wounded beast. Reports flooded in, torpedo hits, bomb strikes, fires uncontrolled, casualties mounting. He gave his orders steadily, commanding men to fight on, to seal the ship, to keep her alive as long as possible. He knew what they faced. He knew survival was impossible, yet he would not falter while his men still fought. For the Americans, the scene below was astonishing. Yamato was no ordinary target, even as bombs ripped through her decks, even as torpedoes hammered her flanks, she refused to die. Her great hull cut through the water. Her guns filled the sky with bursts of fire, her defiance unmatched. Some pilots felt a grim respect, almost pity, as they pressed the attack. Others felt only the exhilaration of the hunt, the determination to finish the job. Torpedoes struck again, first on the port side, then on the starboard. The ship lurched violently. Her list now greater, her speed faltering. Still she moved. Still her screws churned the sea, but the water was rising faster than pumps could fight. On deck, men braced themselves against the tilt, dragging hoses across slanting floors, slipping in blood and oil. Their world had become a furnace, the air thick with smoke, the deck beneath them trembling as explosions echoed through her body. The second wave withdrew, banking hard and climbing back into the sky. In their wake, Yamato was a scarred giant. Her decks ablaze, her superstructure blackened, her hull punctured again and again. Yet she still lived, still fought, still resisted the fate closing in around her. And already more dots were appearing on the horizon. By midday, the third and fourth waves struck. More than 300 planes in total had now been launched against her. The attacks overlapped, chaos upon chaos, until the sky was filled with a storm of wings, bombs, and tracers. Torpedoes hammered her port side again and again, each one tearing deeper into her armored belly, flooding compartments, breaking the balance of the ship. The list grew worse, 15 degrees, then 20. Men stumbled as they ran, slipping across tilted decks, struggling to keep footing as the sea claimed more of her stability. The air above was a vision of hell. Explosions tore through clouds, planes spiraled down in smoke, debris rained upon the waves. For every American lost, dozens pressed on undeterred. For every Japanese gun crew silenced, another man stepped into place, firing upward until flames consumed him too. It was not battle anymore. It was annihilation. By 12:30, Yamato's speed had slowed drastically. Her engines strained, her rudders sluggish. Smoke poured from her funnels, black and choking, billowing into the sky like a funeral pyre. Her escorts were battered too, destroyers hammered by bombs and strafing runs, the cruiser Yahagi struck and sinking. Around her, the formation that had begun with pride was disintegrating, each ship fighting alone, each crew drowning in fire. And yet Yamato endured. With every hit she absorbed, with every explosion that tore through her body, she bought a few more minutes of defiance. To her men, those minutes mattered. They stood at their guns, shouted orders, pulled wounded comrades to safety, and prayed as the sea rose around them. To the Americans above, those minutes were the measure of how long it took to break the largest battleship in history. The storm raged on, bomb after bomb, torpedo after torpedo, until the ocean itself seemed to boil around her, and still she would not sink. Not yet. The storm had passed, but it had not ended. By early afternoon, the sky above the East China Sea was a haze of smoke and exhaust trails, the water littered with burning oil and the wreckage of planes that had not returned. Yet in the center of it all, Yamato still floated, battered and bleeding, her decks ablaze, her hull torn open in half a dozen places. She was no longer the invincible fortress that had slipped from Kur's hidden docks 4 years earlier. She was a wounded giant, staggering, gasping, yet still alive. The list to port had grown severe. 25 degrees, then 28. Men scrambled across slanting decks, slipping as waves washed over the steel. Gun crews fought to keep their weapons level, straining against gravity itself as the ship leaned farther with every torpedo that struck. Damage control officers shouted orders, sealing compartments, pumping water, fighting fires that seemed to spring from every corner. But the ship's wounds were too many, too deep. Every effort slowed the dying, but nothing could change it. On her forward deck, the great 18-inch guns stood silent. Ammunition hoists were wrecked. Fire had gutted the loading chambers, and the crews who once manned them were gone. Only a few of her secondary batteries still fired, spitting defiance into the empty sky. Anti-aircraft crews clung to their weapons, fingers raw from the triggers, eyes red from smoke, refusing to abandon their posts even as flames licked around them. Below, the engineering spaces were a nightmare. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes, scalding men where they stood. Pumps roared but could not keep pace with the sea pouring through torn bulkheads. The heat was unbearable, oxygen dwindling, yet the engineers kept working, hands burned, lungs seared, refusing to leave their stations. One shouted above the din that the list was beyond recovery, that the ship was lost. Another silenced him with a glance, and turned back to the gauges, unwilling to abandon duty even as the ocean swallowed the ship around them. On the bridge, Admiral Seiichi Hito received report after report. Torpedo strikes. Boiler rooms flooded. Casualties in the thousands. Guns silenced. He listened, face unreadable, then ordered the flag lowered from Yahagi, the cruiser already sinking, and hoisted aboard Yamato herself. She would remain the fleet's flagship until her end. He knew what was coming, and yet he stood tall, commanding his officers, speaking with calm, even as the sea claimed his fleet. For the men scattered across the ship, reality could not be denied. Fires raged out of control. Black smoke poured from her funnels, rising like a funeral pyre into the afternoon sky. Oil slicks trailed from her wounds, staining the water in long black ribbons. The list was now so severe that men had to crawl to cross decks, clinging to whatever they could find. Below, sailors trapped in sealed compartments pounded on bulkheads, their voices muffled by steel and water, fading as the sea rose to silence them. American planes circled above, watching. Some dived again, loosing final bombs and torpedoes into the wounded monster, determined to finish her. Others simply observed, their fuel running low, their eyes fixed on the spectacle of the largest battleship in history being consumed before them. For the pilots, there was awe, pity, and satisfaction all at once. They had fought her, broken her, and now they watched her die. At 12:45 p.m., a final series of torpedoes struck. The list surged past 30 degrees. Men clung to railings. Others slid helplessly across decks into the sea. Some jumped willingly, stripping off shoes, plunging into the black water below, choosing the ocean over fire. Others stayed, gripping their guns, shouting prayers, refusing to abandon the ship that had become their coffin. The officers gathered on the bridge, knew the end had come. Admiral Itum, pale but steady, gave his final orders. Save who could be saved. Abandon ship, if possible. Fight to the last. If not, he did not expect to leave Yamato alive, and he would not. He bowed to his officers, then returned to his place at the bridge windows, watching as the sea rose toward him. At 1 p.m., the list reached 35 degrees. Explosions ripped through the hull as fires reached the magazines. Ammunition detonated in sudden violent bursts, tearing away chunks of the superstructure. The ship's bow lifted briefly, then slammed back into the waves. The sea poured across the decks, rushing into gunwells, flooding stairwells, dragging men down with irresistible weight. And yet, even in those final moments, Yamato fought. Her guns barked one last time, shells streaking upward into an empty sky. The sound was hollow, futile, but it was defiance to the very end. A few surviving gunners cheered, voices hoarse, as if that final volley proved the ship's soul was unbroken even as her body crumbled. For the Americans circling above, the scene was almost biblical, a titan in flames, smoke rising miles into the air, explosions shaking the sea, men leaping into the water by the hundreds. Some pilots recorded the moment in words that would never leave them. They had fought many battles, sunk many ships, but never had they witnessed such a sight. The largest warship ever built, dying in fire and fury, dragging thousands with her into the abyss. The ocean heaved, waves crashing against steel. As Yamato rolled farther to port, men scrambled along her sides, clinging desperately, some still firing rifles at the planes overhead, their shots lost in the immensity of destruction. The noise was deafening. Explosions, flames, screams, the endless roar of the sea. Then, as the list passed 40 degrees, silence fell for a heartbeat, a moment where the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Yamato was finished. The sea was ready to take her. The afternoon sun burned pale through the haze, a dim light over a sea that had become a graveyard. Yamato, the once proud fortress of steel, was no longer a warship but a broken mountain adrift, bleeding fire and oil into the water. Her list had grown beyond 45 degrees, her decks nearly vertical, her crew clinging desperately to railings, ladders, gun mounts, anything that offered one last hold against the inevitable pull of the sea. Inside her hull, the fires raged unchecked. Flames tore through ammunition stores, detonating shells in chain reactions that ripped apart compartments, flinging steel fragments through bulkheads as if they were paper. Below decks, men drowned in darkness, trapped behind sealed doors as water rushed in with unstoppable force. Their voices had faded hours into the attack, but some still pounded faintly, the sound swallowed by the roar of the sea. Above, the Americans circled, watching as history's largest battleship staggered on the brink of death. Pilots leaned from cockpits to glimpse the spectacle, their radios filled with clipped voices, confirming hits, noting the list, describing the fire. Some were stunned into silence. Others spoke words that mixed awe and relief. They had achieved what once seemed unthinkable. Yamato, the great monster of the sea, was dying under their eyes. At 1:07 p.m., the inevitable happened. The fires reached the forward magazines, where hundreds of massive 18-inch shells were stored. The detonation began deep inside her, a shockwave that tore upward through steel decks, venting through the funnels with the force of a volcano. A blinding flash erupted from the heart of the ship, followed by an explosion so vast it split the heavens. The blast was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. It ripped Yamato apart, breaking her spine, hurling fragments of steel into the sky like shrapnel from some titanic grenade. Men were flung hundreds of feet, bodies torn from the decks, their cries lost in the roar. The column of smoke and fire soared 5 miles into the sky, visible from the American fleet far over the horizon. Some who watched swore it looked like the eruption of a volcano rising out of the sea. Others compared it to a mushroom cloud, an image that would foreshadow what was yet to come in Japan's war. The explosion shook the ocean itself. Waves radiated outward, slamming into the destroyers that had sailed at her side. Some escorts were rocked so violently that men were thrown from decks, believing for a moment that the earth had split beneath them. Those ships turned away, their commanders ordering retreat, for nothing could survive in the inferno at Yamato's center. When the blast subsided, nothing remained of the great ship's pride. Her bow and stern, torn free by the explosion, sank separately, swallowed by the sea. The midsection burned, then rolled beneath the waves, trailing fire and smoke until the ocean closed over her. The sound was a groan, as though the sea itself had consumed a beast too large for the world to hold. Thousands of men went with her. Some clung to debris, oil slicked and burned, coughing seawater as they floated amid wreckage. Others slipped beneath the surface in silence, pulled down by suction never to rise again. Of her crew of more than 3,000, fewer than 300 would survive. The rest vanished with their ship, claimed by the sea in one vast instant of destruction. For the American pilots circling above, the sight was unforgettable. They had fought many battles, sunk many ships, but nothing compared to watching Yamato erupt and disappear. Some cheered, exhaling the adrenaline of combat. Others sat quiet, struck by the sheer scale of what they had just witnessed. A few wrote later that they felt sorrow, pity for the men whose lives had been erased in seconds, but war left little time for reflection. They turned their planes for home, fuel running low, leaving behind only the smoke that marked the grave of a legend. On the bridge of one American carrier, an officer stood with binoculars watching the towering column of smoke. He lowered them slowly and said nothing. Around him, the crew whispered, voices hushed, as if they had seen something more than victory, something that belonged to history itself. The age of the battleship, the age of steel giants, had ended not with triumph, but with fire and silence. The sea rolled back into calm. Oil burned on the surface, wreckage drifted, and the cries of survivors echoed faintly across the water. But Yamato was gone. The ship that had been built to ensure an empire's dominance, that had carried the hopes and pride of a nation, that had symbolized invincibility, had been erased in a single colossal detonation. Her legend would live on, but her body now rested beneath the waves, broken, scattered, consumed. The ocean had claimed her, as it had claimed so many before, but never before had the sea swallowed something so immense, so filled with meaning, so bound to the fate of a nation. In that moment, as the smoke towered and the waves settled, the war itself seemed to shift. The greatest battleship ever built was gone, and with her the last breath of Japan's naval dream. When the explosion faded, the sea returned to silence. The vast column of smoke still towered into the sky, a dark scar that could be seen for miles, but the thunder had passed. Yamato was gone. Where once a titan of steel had ploughed through the waves, there was now only fire on the water, twisted wreckage drifting, and the faint cries of men scattered in the oil-slicked sea. The ocean had swallowed her in moments, the largest battleship in history, reduced to fragments beneath the waves. The sea seemed strangely calm, as though indifferent to the thousands of lives it had just claimed. It had taken ships for centuries, swallowed fleets in storms and battles, and now it had taken Yamato too, with no hesitation, no ceremony, no regret. For the American pilots circling above, the scene was surreal. They banked their planes, engines humming steadily, fuel gauges dropping. The mission was complete. Radio chatter filled the airwaves with clipped confirmations: target destroyed, ship sunk, returning to base. Yet behind the routine words there lingered awe, and something close to unease. They had just ended the life of a ship that was more than a weapon, more than an enemy. They had witnessed the fall of a myth. Some pilots admitted later that they felt pity. They saw sailors struggling in the water, tiny figures waving from the black slick of burning oil. Others confessed they forced themselves not to look, focusing on their flight paths, telling themselves the war demanded no hesitation. They had done their duty, and in war, duty left little room for mercy. As they turned for home, the American formations stretched across the sky, wings flashing in the pale light. Hundreds of planes, each pilot carrying the memory of what they had seen. On the carriers, crews awaited their return, ready with fuel, ammunition, and food. For the pilots, there would be debriefings, brief words of congratulations, perhaps even smiles of relief. But in quiet moments, the image of Yamato's final detonation would stay with them, burned into memory forever. Below in the water, chaos reigned. Survivors clung to floating debris, coughing seawater, their uniforms soaked in oil. Some shouted for comrades, their voices hoarse, their eyes searching desperately across the waves. Others floated in stunned silence, unable to speak, unable to process what had just happened. The sea around them was alive with fire, slicks of oil burning in patches, waves carrying fragments of steel, splinters of wood, even shoes and caps torn from the dead. Japanese destroyers that had survived the onslaught moved cautiously among the wreckage. Their commanders had orders: save survivors if possible, but above all preserve the fleet's dignity and return to base. They threw ropes and lifelines to men who reached for them, pulling aboard those still breathing, but the numbers were too great, the ocean too wide, the cries too many. Of the more than 3,000 men who had sailed aboard Yamato, fewer than 300 would live to see land again. The rest were gone, scattered beneath the sea, claimed in a single hour of annihilation. One survivor, years later, recalled clinging to wreckage as the great column of smoke drifted into the distance. He remembered the silence most, how the roar of engines and bombs had vanished, how the ocean seemed almost peaceful once more, even as it carried the bodies of his comrades past him. He thought of his family, of the home he would never see again, and of Yamato herself, the great ship that had been his world. She was gone, and with her so was the life he had known. On the American side, the fleet recorded the loss in its logs with the cold precision of war. Enemy battleship Yamato sunk, enemy cruiser Yahagi sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, thousands killed. Losses to our aircraft minimal. The numbers told the story in neat lines, but the reality was not so clean. Pilots returned with shaking hands, mechanics counted bullet holes in wings, and officers stared long at the smoke still visible on the horizon. For the Japanese commanders who received the news, the shock was heavy, though not unexpected. They had known Operation 10 Go was a gamble, a suicide mission cloaked in the language of honor, but when word arrived that Yamato had been lost, that nearly all her crew had perished, the weight of it was unmistakable. The last symbol of Japan's naval might was gone. The empire's breath had grown shallower still. And so the sea went quiet. The waves closed over the wreckage, the smoke drifted slowly into the sky, and the cries of survivors faded into the distance. In that silence, history had turned a page. The battleship era was over. Air power had claimed the future, and beneath the waters of the East China Sea lay the twisted bones of a ship that had once embodied a nation's pride. For the men who had fought, who had died, who had watched, the day would never be forgotten. Yamato's end was not just another battle, not just another ship sunk. It was the death of a legend, the final act of an age that had already passed. The ocean had closed over her, but the memory would never vanish. The smoke drifted for hours after Yamato sank, a dark pillar marking the place where steel and men had vanished. The sea itself was calm again, indifferent, rolling gently as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. But for those who had seen it, for those who had survived it, for those who would hear of it, the moment carried an echo that would never fade. In Japan, the news was received with silence. Operation 10 Go had been declared an act of sacrifice from the start, but when the scale of the loss became clear, even the most hardened officials struggled to find words. 3,000 lives extinguished in a single day. The largest warship in the world erased in less than 2 hours. The final hope of the Imperial Navy gone, leaving only fragments scattered across the homeland's waters. Some spoke of honor, of loyalty unto death, of Yamato fulfilling her destiny as the sword of the empire. Others whispered the truth, that it had been futility, that pride had demanded a sacrifice which achieved nothing but tragedy. For the sailors who had perished, duty had been the final bond. They had stood at their guns even as the decks burned beneath them. They had sealed bulkheads even as water rose to their throats. They had fought not because they believed in victory, but because they believed in one another. For many, the word jiri, obligation, was the heartbeat of their final hours. They fought because their comrades fought, because their officers commanded it, because their families expected it, because to falter was to betray all three. Among the survivors, the memories burned. One man recalled watching his friend man an anti-aircraft gun until flames engulfed him, his hands never leaving the grips. Another remembered hearing the voices of trapped sailors behind a sealed bulkhead, their fists pounding, their cries desperate until silence came. Others remembered the sheer heat, the smoke so thick it blinded, the ocean rushing in, the sudden absence of sound when the ship rolled beneath them. They carried those echoes for the rest of their lives. On the American side, too, the echoes lingered. Pilots returned to their carriers. Mechanics counted the bullet holes in wings. Officers logged the strike as a victory. Yet, in the quiet of night, some remembered the sight of men flailing in the burning sea, of bodies hurled skyward by the final explosion. They had done their duty, they had fulfilled the mission, but they knew they had also extinguished thousands of human lives in a single day. It was the paradox of war, triumph and tragedy bound together so tightly that neither could be separated from the other. Historians later would say Yamato's voyage was doomed from the moment it was conceived. Her very size, once her greatest strength, had become her weakness. She was too large to maneuver, too slow to evade, too valuable to ignore. Against the massed air power of the American fleet, she was a giant without shelter. Her final mission was not a battle plan but a ceremony of death, a gesture of defiance written in steel. Yet, symbolism has its own power. For Japan, Yamato became the embodiment of sacrifice, the willingness to give all for nation and emperor. For the United States, her destruction was proof that the age of the battleship had ended, that air power now ruled the seas. For the world, she became a lesson in the futility of pride, of how legends can blind leaders to reality, of how even the strongest can fall when the future arrives. There was another echo, softer, more human. It was the echo of young men, thousands of them, who had boarded Yamato knowing they would not return. They had written letters they would never send, folded charms they would never carry home, spoken jokes that carried fear beneath them. They had laughed, prayed, smoked, sung songs, and then gone to their deaths. Their names would not be remembered individually, their faces blurred into the collective memory of a lost ship, but their humanity lingered in the silence that followed her sinking. Duty had carried them to the end. For some it was honor, for others resignation, for still others simply love for the comrades beside them. In their final moments, Yamato's crew lived not as warriors in a myth but as men bound together, clinging to meaning in the face of inevitability. That was their echo, the one that still drifts across the sea when the waves roll quiet and the sky clears. The world moved on. New ships were built, new wars were fought, new generations rose. But the echo of Yamato's duty, her sacrifice, her futility remains. She was more than a battleship. She was a reminder that duty can inspire greatness, but also tragedy, that pride can give strength, but also blind, that men can fight with courage, even when they know the fight cannot be won. And so, long after the sea swallowed her, Yamato still speaks. Not with guns, not with steel, but with silence. An echo that lingers across the waves, whispering of duty, of sacrifice, of the fragile line between honor and despair. Long after the smoke had drifted into the sky, long after the waves had closed over the broken steel, the ocean returned to silence. It rolled gently as it always had, indifferent, carrying no trace of the greatest battleship that had ever sailed. Yamato was gone. Yet her presence remained, not in steel, not in fire, but in memory. For the survivors who drifted in the sea, the last wave of Yamato was not the towering column of smoke, but the ripples that carried them away from her grave. They clung to planks and barrels, coughing oil from their lungs, staring at the horizon where the ship had been only hours earlier. Some wept openly. Others stared blankly, their minds too numb to comprehend what had been lost. They had sailed aboard a legend, and now they floated among ghosts. In the months that followed, Japan's war would collapse entirely. Okinawa fell after a bitter struggle, then Hiroshima and Nagasaki were consumed by nuclear fire, and at last the emperor himself spoke the word surrender. Yamato's sacrifice had bought nothing but memory. Her mission had not stopped the Americans, had not shielded the homeland, had not changed the tide of war. Yet, in another sense, her voyage was the final exclamation mark at the end of an age. The age of the battleship ended not in triumph, but in silence. For centuries, nations had poured fortunes into building ever greater ships of the line, dreadnoughts, floating fortresses of steel meant to dominate the seas. Yamato was the pinnacle of that dream. Larger, stronger, more heavily armed than any that came before. And yet she was destroyed, not by another ship, but by aircraft. By men in cockpits who dropped bombs and torpedoes from the sky. Her death announced to the world that the ocean would never again belong to giants of steel alone. The future belonged to air power, to carriers, to weapons that came from above. But her story was not just about strategy or technology. It was about men, about the 3,000 sailors who gave their lives aboard her, and about the pilots who ended them. It was about pride and despair, about duty and futility, about the ways war devours both victors and vanquished alike. Yamato's last wave was not simply an explosion. It was a reminder of how fragile even the greatest creations of man can be. Today, beneath the waters of the East China Sea, Yamato rests in pieces, her hull scattered across the seabed. Rust has claimed her, coral grows where guns once thundered, fish swim where sailors once worked. She has become part of the ocean she once ruled. Divers who visit her wreck speak of the silence, of the weight of history pressing against them as they glide among her bones. They say it feels less like exploring a wreck than entering a tomb. And yet her name lives on. In Japan, Yamato remains a symbol of sacrifice and pride, her story told in books, in films, in whispers of remembrance. Around the world, she is remembered as both the greatest and the last of her kind, the sea's monster who met her end in fire. To some, she is a lesson in futility, to others a monument to courage, to all she is history, written in steel and sealed by the ocean. The last wave of Yamato was not the one that broke her hull or hurled her men into the sea. It was the wave of memory that rippled outward, touching every shore, reminding generations of the cost of pride and the price of war. It was a wave that said even legends die, that even the mightiest fall, that the ocean forgets nothing. And so her story ends not in fire, not in steel, but in silence, the silence of the sea that holds her still. Yamato sails no more, but she remains forever in that place between pride and tragedy, between honor and futility, between history and memory. The sea took her, but the sea also keeps her. And as long as waves break against the shore, the echo of Yamato's final voyage will remain, whispering of duty, of sacrifice, of the last great battleship that ever lived.